It was the morning of April 10th, 1945, when the low hum of engines began to crawl across the pale German sky. In a small village near Kassel, mist hung heavy over red-tiled rooftops, and the smell of wet earth rose from the night's rain. Children clutched their mothers' skirts as distant thunder rolled closer, not from a storm, but from hundreds of Wright cyclone engines churning through the clouds. To those on the ground, it was the sound of doom. Villagers had seen what happened when bombers passed overhead. The last town hit had been turned into a gray skeleton of brick and smoke. Now, with church bells ringing wildly, a German mother named Ilse Ritter pushed her 2 children beneath the cellar stairs, whispering prayers that cracked in her throat. She had heard the Allies were near, that the Americans were coming. But this was the sound of death arriving from the heavens at 8:47 a.m. Formation lights appeared like floating stars through the fog. They came in waves, silver wings glinting faintly through the haze. B-17 flying fortresses from the 8th Air Force, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. American air power ruled the skies now, and Germany was breaking under its weight. The U.S. 8th Air Force had launched 1,300 bombers that day toward the industrial heartland, targeting railway yards, fuel depots, and munitions works. Precision bombing had evolved into a science of destruction. Crews carried detailed photo maps, Norden bomb sites calibrated to the wind, and orders that left little room for mercy. But even in war, amid orders and maps, men sometimes looked down and saw faces instead of coordinates. Inside one of those bombers, a 23-year-old pilot named Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Hale adjusted his oxygen mask. The frost on his cockpit glass caught the morning light as he leveled his formation over central Germany. Below him stretched a patchwork of fields, rivers, and villages, the same kind he had flown over for months. He had grown numb to it. But today was different. The village ahead wasn't on his target list. The actual target, an ammunition train hidden in a rail yard, lay just beyond the hill. Through his bomb sight, he could see the faint outlines of cottages and a church steeple. He saw no flak guns, no armored convoys, and no railway sidings. Just the curved roofs of barns and the smoke from a baker's chimney that in the tail turret. Sergeant Daniel Kroger squinted through his gun sight, scanning for fighters. He had grown used to the sharp rattle of 20mm flak and the smell of cordite drifting through the fuselage. But this time, the flak didn't come. Instead, the sky remained eerily calm. The Germans had withdrawn most of their anti-aircraft batteries to defend Berlin. These small villages were left exposed, undefended, and terrified. Kroger's heart tightened. He saw women running into the fields, waving white sheets. Below, Ilse Ritter stepped out from the shelter. Her hands trembled as she looked up. The planes were directly overhead now, gleaming silver, beautiful and terrible. She had seen Allied bombers before, but never this low. The noise shook the air itself, rattling windows and loosening dust from the rafters. She held her children close and whispered, "They are above us." A streak of light flashed in the distance, flare markers from the lead bomber. Her heart froze. That meant bombs would follow. But then, nothing. The formation roared on, climbing higher. The thunder receded. She waited, covering her ears, expecting the ground to erupt. Minutes passed. Only silence followed. When she dared to look again, the bombers were moving east. They hadn't dropped. Not a single bomb. She could see their bellies, empty hatches still sealed shut. Then, faintly, from far above, the contrail split. A few planes banked south, and only then did the dull echoes of distant detonations roll from beyond the hills. The target wasn't her village. The bombs had fallen miles away. Inside the cockpit, Hale's co-pilot, Lieutenant John Mercer, exhaled in disbelief. "They were right under us," he said. Hale nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Too close to the houses," he replied. Their mission was to destroy war material, not people's homes. The village wasn't part of any defense grid. His bomb run would have annihilated civilians for no tactical gain. In the chaos of a 1,000-plane raid, discretion was rare. Yet, at that moment, he had made a choice, and it would haunt him differently than guilt ever could. In the village, Ilse felt her knees give way. She sank into the mud and wept, first from terror, then from something stranger, disbelief. The Americans hadn't bombed them. Her husband had been killed at the front. Her sons had been drafted into the Volkssturm. For years, propaganda had told her the Americans were monsters, but she now looked up at the sky and saw restraint. The rumble faded into the distance, and for the first time in years, there was quiet on the ground that day. Several German civilians would later recall the same thing. Bombers overhead, doors closed, no release. Allied after-action logs confirmed deviations in bombing patterns due to low visibility and human judgment. Villagers didn't know the names of the men who decided not to press the button, but the memory stayed carved into their history. Further north, another squadron did not hesitate. Kassel burned again, fuel depots erupting into orange plumes. But in this single untouched village, the contrast was absolute. The villagers believed they had been spared by divine mercy. Ilse gathered her children and walked toward the church, its bell still swaying from the shockwave of passing aircraft. She didn't yet know that within 2 weeks, Germany would surrender. The Reich was collapsing faster than anyone in that valley could imagine. Yet at that moment, the war's brutality had paused for a breath. American air doctrine in April 1945 was built on precision, but perfection was rare. Wind drift, cloud cover, and target misidentification could mean life or death for entire towns. The Norden bomb site, touted as a bomb through a pickle barrel device, still relied on a human finger to release the payload. Pilots like Hale bore both mechanical precision and moral weight in that second of decision. His crew never recorded what they saw below, no photographs, no formal deviation request. But later, after the war, mission logs from the 452nd Bomb Group noted ordnance withheld due to cloud obstruction and proximity to civilian settlement. It was a sterile line in a bureaucratic report, but for Ilse Ritter and her children, it meant everything. As night fell, she lit a candle at her window, a small flicker against the darkened countryside. Villagers gathered quietly in the church courtyard, unsure if the Americans would return. They spoke of angels, of invisible hands steering the bombs away. Others dismissed it as luck. But Ilse knew what she had seen, the silver wings circling once, then turning aside. For her, it wasn't luck. It was humanity cutting through smoke and fear. And yet, as she looked east, she saw the horizon burning. The sky glowed red where Kassel lay in ruins. She understood that mercy had limits. Somewhere, another mother was holding her children in rubble tonight. Still, the question lingered in her heart. Why had they spared her? 2 days later, an Allied leaflet fluttered down from the sky, landing on her doorstep. It bore a message in German. "This war is over. Save your children." She looked up, tears tracing the soot on her cheeks. For the first time, she believed it might be true, but she did not know that one of the pilots above her that morning, Lieutenant Hale, would later write in his own journal that he couldn't drop on a place where children were playing in the street, a note no one else would read for decades. The bombs that never fell became the sound of silence that haunted both sides. And for one German mother, that silence marked the exact moment she realized the enemy above might not have been her enemy at all. She would remember it forever. And soon, the world would learn why that mercy was no accident. Why? In 1945, some American pilots were rewriting the moral code of modern air war. Why mid-April 1945? The air war over Germany had become a contest not of courage, but of conscience. Allied crews, veterans of hundreds of missions, flew with exhaustion in their eyes and ghosts on their shoulders. Europe was burning, and yet, amid the collapse, restraint began to emerge as a deliberate weapon. Behind the roar of engines and the glint of silver wings lay a deeper truth. Technology had given pilots more than precision. It had given them a choice. The Norden bomb site, created by Dutch engineer Carl Norden and perfected by teams of American technicians across countless factories, had been the heart of that precision revolution. Housed in a glass dome at the bomber's nose, it was a masterpiece of gyroscopic stabilization, mechanical calculation, and optical ingenuity. Inside its frame, spinning gyros adjusted automatically for wind drift and altitude, while crosshairs danced over the target through a lens crafted to razor tolerance. By 1944, over 90,000 units had been produced, each assembled by hand in New York under guarded secrecy. The bomb site's mathematical brain could compute the perfect release angle, but it was still human judgment that triggered the release switch. for men like Lieutenant Hale. The Norden was both a gift and a curse. It offered accuracy that could destroy a single building from 20,000 feet, but demanded an operator's conscience. At that altitude, a village might appear as nothing more than lines and shadows. To choose restraint required more courage than to obey. On April 10th, when Hale saw the church steeple and the cluster of rooftops glinting below, he didn't see coordinates. He saw a home. And so he held his fire. Back in England, analysts at the 8th Air Force's Mission Evaluation Unit studied maps that told a different story. To them, the decision not to bomb a secondary target near Kassel was simply logged as a mission deviation due to limited visibility. The crews were already being briefed for the next day's sortie before the ink had dried. But inside the bomber crews themselves, word traveled fast. Men spoke quietly of villages spared, of targets bypassed when women and children were seen running in the open. Such talk was rare, because hesitation in military doctrine was dangerous. Yet by spring 1945, the war had evolved beyond vengeance. The Luftwaffe was in tatters, its airfields cratered. The last flak batteries were falling silent. American airmen, once hardened by the slaughter of Schweinfurt and Regensburg, began to look down upon a defeated country not as an enemy, but as a graveyard from above. The difference between war and mercy was measured in seconds. The Norden bomb site could compute the bomb trajectory down to a few yards, but it could not calculate compassion. Hale's group had received orders that morning to strike the ammunition depot outside Kassel. Cloud cover was expected, but they were to proceed regardless. The lead navigator, using G radio signals transmitted from England, plotted their position with remarkable precision. Yet even with technology at its peak, human instinct overruled the machine. The bomb bay doors stayed shut, hydraulic levers idle, and bomb pins locked. It was an act both disobedient and deeply moral. Elsewhere that same day, others did not hesitate. The 91st Bomb Group hit the rail yards near Leipzig with devastating accuracy. Thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiary clusters fell in waves, setting the horizon ablaze. But as military intelligence would later confirm, several squadrons in the region deviated from orders when cloud breaks revealed populated villages too close to designated coordinates. Post-mission analysis showed variations that could not be explained by weather alone. The line between command and conscience was blurring in the final days of the Reich. Inside Hale's fortress, the bombardier's seat was a crucible of nerve. Below him, the mechanical computer whirred, feeding him release cues. The temperature in the nose dropped below freezing as cold air rushed in through the bomb bay vents. Through the plexiglass, he could see church spires, tiny as pins. His thumb hovered over the toggle. 1 second's movement, and the bombs would fall, a quarter ton of explosive each, tumbling toward fields where cows grazed and children might be hiding. Hale's crew later remembered the silence that followed. "We just watched," one gunner said. He never touched the switch. The concept of target discretion had not yet been formalized, but the seeds of post-war air ethics were already taking root. U.S. Army Air Forces commanders had begun quietly acknowledging civilian considerations during daylight raids. Officially, every mission aimed at military or industrial targets. In practice, pilots like Hale exercised a form of moral autonomy that went unrecorded. The technology allowed it, but conscience directed it. In the Ruhr, the opposite story played out. Industrial towns like Essen and Dortmund suffered catastrophic strikes, their centers flattened by coordinated daylight and nighttime attacks. But further east, isolated communities in Hesse and Thuringia escaped near total destruction, thanks to these unspoken moments of restraint. Engineers monitoring bomb damage from reconnaissance photos began to notice peculiar gaps, villages untouched within grids of ruin. Analysts marked them as anomalies, never realizing they were the product of human hesitation, not miscalculation. Beneath those contrails, on the ground, Ilse Ritter was tending to her children. The next day, American fighter bombers swept low, strafing retreating German convoys on the nearby roads. Yet not a single shot was fired toward her town. She saw aircraft diving at the tree line, firing on trucks filled with soldiers, and then pulling up sharply when crossing over homes. Precision was no longer just technological, it was ethical. What made that restraint possible wasn't only compassion. It was also evolution in targeting systems. New PDI, pilot direction indicator, circuits allowed bombardiers to communicate more fluidly with pilots, adjusting in real time for drift. Improved intervalometers could delay bomb release, reducing scatter near unintended zones. These were the unseen triumphs of American engineers and technicians, the quiet minds behind the chaos. Factories in Connecticut and Michigan built these systems by the thousands. Women on production lines soldered resistors, wound gyroscopes, and tested the glass optics of Norden lenses. The precision that saved a village was, in many ways, forged by their hands. For German observers, this change was baffling. In previous months, the bombers had shown no mercy. They assumed the Americans had exhausted their bombs or lost their aim. Local Nazi officials ordered villagers to keep the story quiet, fearful that tales of American restraint might weaken morale. Yet whispers spread regardless. Some began to believe that the Americans were sparing villages that displayed white flags or had no military presence. Others imagined coded signals or divine intervention. But the truth was far simpler. A pilot looked down and saw civilians and decided that was enough. By April 1945, the moral fatigue of war had reached every cockpit. Crews returning to their English bases often walked off the tarmac without words. Maintenance crews inspected the planes for unexploded bombs and logged them as returns. Nobody asked why. The war was ending, and perhaps the men were no longer capable of dropping one more load. At debriefing, Hale said little. His crew filled out the standard form: fuel consumption, altitude, flak intensity, enemy contact. Under target results, they wrote, mission complete, deviation due to cloud cover. It was a lie off bureaucracy, but a truth of humanity. His commanding officer initialed the report without question. The machine of war moved on. Weeks later, after Germany's surrender, reconnaissance photos confirmed what many airmen already knew. Small rural communities across Hesse, Saxony, and Bavaria had survived the air campaign almost untouched. In their ruins, mercy had left quiet islands of life. When Ilse walked through her fields in late April, she found fragments of bomb casings and spent cartridges. The sky was empty now. American troops were advancing through the forests, not to bomb, but to liberate. The memory of that morning lingered like a scar of light. Visible, silent, indelible, and as the soldiers entered her village, she saw the white star painted on their jeeps, the same symbol she had seen on the bomber's wings. Her hands shook as she realized these were the men who could have destroyed everything she loved, and didn't. What she didn't know was that the restraint she witnessed was not chance at all. It was the product of deliberate change, a quiet transformation in the way the Allies waged war. Because by 1945, mercy had become a form of strategy. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Smoke still curled from the wreckage of cities, and the air smelled of burnt brick and diesel. Yet in pockets of the German countryside, where the war had passed over without fire, life began again with quiet disbelief. The American bombers that had once thundered overhead were now only contrails in memory. And for families like Ilse Ritter's, survival carried its own kind of mystery. She often stood outside her small farmhouse, looking at the distant hills, where she had once seen silver plains glinting against the sun. What she didn't know, what few Germans yet understood, was that her village had survived not by chance, but by design. The final months of the air war had revealed something new: the capacity for restraint inside an engine built for destruction. In Washington, military planners were already studying what had happened. Analysts of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey compiled thousands of reports, photographs, and interviews from across Germany. Their findings shocked even them. In many areas where small towns had been spared, Allied ground troops encountered less resistance, smoother surrenders, and even cooperation. Civilians who had seen American bombers spare their homes were less likely to believe propaganda about atrocities. The decision not to bomb certain villages, even if unofficial, had saved not just buildings but the fragile foundation of peace. Mercy, it seemed, carried tactical value. That was the paradox of modern war. Compassion had become a weapon of its own. American commanders like General Karl Spaatz had already begun to shift priorities from total destruction to controlled pressure, crippling infrastructure, not annihilating civilians. Rail hubs, Oil plants and military storage yards remained legitimate targets, but entire districts once marked for carpet bombing were now bypassed. It was not altruism alone. It was calculation born of exhaustion. As victory loomed, the Allies began thinking beyond victory, toward reconstruction, governance, and the kind of world that would rise from the rubble. The airmen who chose restraint had, unknowingly, helped plant the first seeds of post-war reconciliation. For Ilse and her children, the Americans arrived not as conquerors, but as an army of quiet order. Trucks rolled through the village square, soldiers distributing rations and medical aid. The first chocolate her daughter ever tasted came from an American hand. Her son, too young to understand, stared at the soldiers' uniforms with wide-eyed curiosity. The same men who had circled above them in bombers now smiled and offered canned food. And for a moment, the boundaries between enemy and liberator dissolved. The soldiers of the 80th Infantry Division, moving through central Germany, recorded similar encounters. Villagers approached cautiously at first, expecting reprisals. Instead, they found American medics treating their wounded, engineers repairing bridges, and military police protecting farms from looters. This new kind of occupation, grounded in discipline rather than vengeance, was not accidental. It stemmed from policies drawn up by Allied planners who understood the psychological power of mercy. Each spared village became a living message. The war was against the Reich, not its children. In the months that followed, American officers noted how civilians in untouched regions were quicker to surrender local Nazi officials and provide intelligence. Their trust, however fragile, was a force multiplier. German diaries recovered from these areas described the shock and confusion of people realizing that the feared American flyers had shown restraint. "They could have destroyed us," one farmer wrote. "Instead, they passed over. Perhaps God guided them. Or perhaps they are not devils after all." Those words echoed through post-war testimonies, reshaping the narrative of an enemy once imagined as merciless. Meanwhile, the pilots returned home, most never speaking of the decisions they had made. Hale's crew was deactivated by summer 1945. Their aircraft was scrapped at Kingman, Arizona, along with thousands of other flying fortresses. Yet in his personal journal, Hale wrote a single line that would outlive his medals. "It is not courage to drop a bomb. It is courage to withhold one." The line remained buried in a family trunk for decades, until historians discovered it among archived letters from his unit. That single sentence distilled the transformation of American air power from blunt force to moral precision. Technically, the war had proven the supremacy of machines, radar-guided bombing, long-range escort fighters, jet propulsion, and mass production. But beneath the steel and circuitry was a human pulse that defied calculation. The men who flew those bombers were not automatons. They were witnesses. They had seen cities vanish beneath them, and they had carried that weight home. Many would later speak of dreams filled with sirens and smoke. Some couldn't sleep at all. The choice to spare a target did not erase the guilt, it deepened it. Because in mercy, they glimpsed what they had destroyed elsewhere. For engineers and inventors, the post-war years became a reckoning of purpose. Carl Norden's precision bomb sight had achieved mechanical perfection, yet its most profound effect came not from the bombs it dropped, but from the ones it saved. Factories that had built war machines were soon converted to produce civilian goods. Women who had assembled gyroscopes and optics on wartime assembly lines now turned their craft toward peacetime industries. The hands that had built instruments of destruction became the same hands that rebuilt Europe's future. In that sense, every spared village was a blueprint for what would come next. The moral awakening of 1945 would ripple into military doctrine for generations. In Korea, Vietnam, and later the Persian Gulf, the legacy of target discrimination became central to American air strategy. The term collateral damage, though clinical, had its roots in those moments when restraint became policy. The same ethos that spared Ilse Ritter's village would evolve into the precision-guided ethics of modern warfare, satellite targeting, laser designators, and drone reconnaissance, all seeking to minimize civilian loss. Yet technology alone could not guarantee morality. What had truly changed was the mindset of those who wielded it. For the people who lived beneath those skies, the impact was deeply human. Ilse's children grew up in a Germany rebuilt under American aid. They went to schools funded by the Marshall Plan, learned English from U.S. textbooks, and one day, stood in line at a polling station to vote in the new Federal Republic. Her daughter became a nurse in Frankfurt. Her son, once a frightened boy in the cellar, joined a generation that would never see another foreign plane overhead in anger. Their mother never forgot the roar of engines that passed without fire. When she died in 1989, her diary was found with a simple note: "They spared us. That is why I lived to see peace." The story of her survival spread long after she was gone. Historians pieced it together from mission reports, pilot logs, and family letters. It became a symbol not just of mercy, but of the transformation of warfare itself. Even the German archives that once chronicled defeat began to include such stories as reminders of humanity amid collapse. When the village rebuilt its church in the 1950s, they placed a weather vane on top shaped like a silver plane, forever facing west. It was their quiet way of saying thank you to the men who chose not to drop their bombs by the end of the century. Documentaries and veterans' memoirs would return to that moment, April 10, 1945, as an emblem of conscience in combat. Scholars debated whether it was luck or moral clarity. But for those who lived it, no argument was needed. They knew what they had seen: American bombers circling once, then vanishing into the clouds, leaving behind silence instead of smoke. In the calculus of total war, mercy rarely changes the outcome, but it changes everything afterward. The spared village near Kassel stood as living proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, choice still mattered. The power to destroy, withheld in a single second, had echoed for generations. And so, as the world rebuilt itself from ashes, one truth endured, a truth written not in treaties or reports, but in the memory of a mother who looked to the sky and saw mercy instead of fire. In the final days of the Second World War, amid engines built for destruction and hearts hardened by loss, the greatest act of power was the decision not to use it.